So our reading this morning is from Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 23. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 chief ministers over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the chief ministers and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the chief ministers and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these chief ministers and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal ministers, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sunset to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the ring of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of a living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Now, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Amen.
Well, I want to start this morning, as I sometimes do, by talking about John Wesley. But particularly this morning about his father, Samuel. Now, of course, John Wesley lived in the 1700s. And some things were different, many things were different then, but many things are not, especially regarding sin and wrongdoing. Now, in some ways, Samuel wasn't a good role model. He was very domineering, both with his family and his parishioners, at least those of his parishioners that used to listen to him. And he wasn't very good with money. He was always in debt. But as a Christian, he did have the courage of his convictions, even if it was to cost him. Now, he spent a big part of his life, as many of you know, at Epworth as a minister. But before that, he was in the nearby village of South Ormsby. And it was, by the standards of the Church of England, it was a very well-paid position, that. Now, a well-to-do lady, started visiting his wife, Susanna. But then Samuel found out who she was. But she found out she was the mistress of the Lord of the Manor. So Samuel showed her the door and told her not to come back. Now his lordship was furious and went to see Samuel, who told him the same. You know, you're a member of the church. You know, you've got a position. And you know, of authority, you're not allowed a mistress. You're not to have one. You're a married man. His lordship was even more furious and went to see the bishop. And at that, the bishop moved Samuel to the vacant position at Epworth, and put in place someone who would allow the lordship to do what he wanted. Now, now. It cost Samuel. It cost him. It cost him, of course, South Ormsby was a better paid position. Epworth was a very remote part of Lincolnshire. It was surrounded for a large part of the year. There was no actual road to it in those days. There's not much of one now, I don't think, but there wasn't one at all. And in the winter, it was surrounded by water, and you needed somebody to row you across in a boat. And of course, financially, Samuel had to buy his own furniture. Where he went to live, there was no furniture, and he wasn't allowed to take that from South Ormsby, where he lived. That was for the new minister that did what he was told. So he had to borrow money. That was probably the beginning of his borrowing. So despite his many faults, Samuel was a man of his convictions, whatever it cost him. And on this occasion, it did cost him. And as we go through the world, it might cost us. Because we're called into the world. We're not called to hide from the world, are we? There's sometimes that temptation to try and do that. We're called to be in the world, but not do as the world does. We need to be men and women of faith to keep trusting God on our journey. But it's important that our faith is consistent with the Bible, that we trust the God of the Bible, not a God that we've changed to suit ourselves. I remember as I've been in the Methodist circuit now 20 years preaching, roughly. And I remember towards the beginning I went to a church, I won't tell you where it was, but it's one that's closed now. And the worship leader was the one that always did the Bible readings. And it was an elderly gentleman. And it was Lent. It was about 3 weeks before Christmas. And I think I was preaching from Isaiah 53. It must have been that. And the worship leader refused to read it because it was the Old Testament. He said he never reads anything out of the Old Testament. He says, can you not find a suitable passage in the New Testament? And I said, well, that's the one I want. That's one. And he refused. So somebody else had to be found to read it. And afterwards he told me, next time I come, I've not to choose anything out of the Old Testament. Now, I was quite new at it then. These days, I would have told him, of course, that Jesus spoke often about, whenever Jesus spoke about the Bible, he spoke about the Old Testament. But I was a bit young, a lot younger and a bit quieter then. And of course, there's those that come to the door sometimes, the JWs and Mormons that come with a nice smile, with a very different message. And, they can do a lot of damage to believers if we listen to them. I was preaching not too long ago at a church, and I preached it must have been Easter time again, because I was preaching about the criminal on the cross. The one where he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And this dear old lady, she wasn't a great, I won't say she was a great theologian, but she had a simple faith in Jesus. And she came to me and she thanked me for my message. And she'd been listening to the Jehovah's Witnesses who told her she wasn't going to heaven when she died. It had upset her because she always believed she was. And she was upset by their message. I told her not to listen to them. I said, just don't. I said, it's not a Christian message. It's not a message that we should be listening to. We must set our hearts and minds on the God of the Bible, just as Daniel did in Babylon. Now, Jerusalem sometime earlier had been captured by the Babylonians. Many of them were killed, but some of the best young men were taken to Babylon as slaves, and Daniel was one of them. He was trained to be in the service of the king, and Daniel proved to be very trustworthy in everything he did. And by the time we get to chapter 6, he'd become a high-ranking official. But he never lost his faith in God. He never compromised. He worked hard, and he worked conscientiously. And because he worked hard and conscientiously, it was noticed. And in life, sometimes we can't always tell them about Jesus, not every day sometimes, but we can work hard and conscientiously at what we do. And if we do that, we will be noticed. I remember, and I suppose Daniel here won't mind me telling, when he was at Bible college, he went for his dinner once, and he left all his stuff on I don't know, he'd got pens and laptops, he'd got all sorts of stuff left on his desk, and he forgot about him. He just went with everyone else for his dinner. Now before that, of course, he'd been to Borbicar School, he'd been to college for a year or two, and then he'd read 12 years at Tesco's. And he did say that any of these other places, a lot of what he'd left would have been nicked by the time he got back. But he was surprised that everything was exactly as he left it, because he was among Christian people. And it's noticed. It is noticed. So back to the narrative. Because of Daniel's witness, because of how he worked, he was to be rewarded. He was so honest and hard-working. He was beyond corruption. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now this was going to provoke envy, wasn't it? Especially among the chief ministers, who they were going to find themselves beneath him. And they tried to find charges against him, but because of his honesty, they found none. So they set a trap. And it's a reminder to us as believers out in the world, we will have enemies. Satan doesn't sleep. But be encouraged, because our God is greater. So this is how their trick was to work. They knew that Daniel prayed 3 times a day to the God of Israel. So these ministers go to the king, and his name is Darius, and they flatter him. They flatter him, and they persuade him to issue a decree that cannot be reversed by anyone, even himself, that anyone who worships any other god except for the king for 30 days shall be thrown into the lion's den, and we'll not ponder on that because it's a brutal way to go. Now, it's not unusual for kings and emperors in the ancient world to be worshipped as gods. Many of the Roman emperors decided they were God. And even today, of course, we talked about the Kims. The Kims are worshipped as gods by their people. They have their, interesting, another little side story about North Korea. They have their own caste system where people are decided what caste they're in depending on their loyalty and the loyalty of their parents and grandparents. The real loyal ones to being loyal to the Kim regime, they're right on the top caste. Then there's the people who are not so sure about at the bottom. And the third group are people that they need to watch that might not be so loyal to Kim. And you very rarely can you jump up a caste. You can go down one, but very rarely can you jump up. And one of the few things that you can do is an act of bravery, like if there's a raging torrent of a flood and you jump into the raging water to rescue a picture of Kim. That's one of the few, that's true, that's one of the few things that can jump you up a cast in your family. I guess you wouldn't survive the torrent, but your family would then jump up one. Anyway, King Darius liked the idea. He loved the flattery of his ministers. Don't they so often love the flattery? The 30 days of adoration and worship to him alone. Now Daniel found out about the law, and he knew he had a choice to make. Should he obey the decree and save his life, or should he remain faithful to God? Well, we know straight away what Daniel was thinking. Straight away, he went back to his house and prayed, facing Jerusalem. Now, in Babylon, Jerusalem must have seemed a long way away, but this was more than sentimentality or a yearning for home. The temple in Jerusalem in the Old Testament times was central to their worship of God. It's where they encountered God. The Holy of Holies, right in the middle, is where they sort of felt the presence of God was. Now, of course, the temple had been ransacked by the Babylonians. But that doesn't matter. You can't ransack God. Now, of course, it's different today because at the cross, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And at Pentecost, God came to where we are. So we don't need to face Jerusalem anymore because God is where we are. But for Daniel, in his time, when he prayed to Jerusalem, he was facing God. Now, of course, this was a trap. And those who set the trap went to the king and asked him about the decree and reminded him it can't be repealed. The king agreed with that, but then they told Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to it and carries on worshipping his God. Now, the king was greatly distressed at this and wanted to set Daniel free, but his accusers kept reminding him of his decree. So reluctantly, he had Daniel lowered into the lion's den and it was sealed. Now, King Darius was so troubled at this, he spent the night without eating, without his usual entertainment, without even sleeping. He knew he couldn't go back on his word without losing face publicly. Anyway, Darius, he was so troubled. He knew he'd been trapped. He couldn't back down. First light, he hurried down to the lion's den and called to Daniel, hoping he was still alive, hoping that his God had saved him. Now, over the centuries, there have been many instances of believers meeting terrible deaths, but there's also instances where God intervenes. I don't know if anybody's read Billy Graham's book on angels. Yeah, there's one or two. But there was a story in there about these two missionaries somewhere in Central Africa that went into a very hostile environment. And one of the early days they were there, they were surrounded by a fearsome tribe who were known for killing anyone that wasn't in their tribe. And they spent the night in prayer, and all night the missionary, the tribe walked round chanting, but never attacked. And some years later, when some of these people had become believers, they asked one of them, well, why did you not attack that night? And he says, we were scared of your tribe that was stood outside guarding. They were so fearsome, we daren't attack. Sometimes God intervenes. And in the case of Daniel, he sent an angel to shut the mouth of the lions and protect him. And with Daniel, the king knew it was because of his innocence that God had saved him. And he said the king's overjoyed and gave orders to have Daniel lifted out the pit, and not one wound was found on him. Now the king got his revenge on the accusers, and I didn't think I'd go into that because it's such a grisly thing. If anybody really wants to read it, you can have a look at when you get home. So as we draw to a close, what do we say about Daniel? Well, he was a man of faith, But faith's not just believing. It is believing, but it's more than that. It's the actions we do because of that faith. With Daniel, he worked hard. He was conscientious in everything he did. He prayed 3 times a day faithfully to God, even when it became illegal. And his faithfulness to God was in a nation that looked down on the God of Israel. Why? Well, because they'd conquered Israel. They'd ransacked the temple in Jerusalem. They'd killed all the priests, and he himself was in Babylon as a captive to these people. And with us, we live in a land in many ways similar to Babylon, a land that is largely godless, that ignores the God of the Bible. There are many people out there that know nothing about what we do, or what we're even about, or what God is about. It's a few years ago now, and the pop singer Rihanna was doing a photo shoot, and she chose a field. She rented this field in the north of Ireland, and she was doing one of her overly raunchy shoots, and the farmer in the field, who was a Christian man, was coming on his tractor thinking it was a porn shoot, and threw them all out and told them not to come back. And he said Rihanna was greatly distressed and said she didn't it's interesting because she says she didn't realise people like that still existed. It makes you think that, doesn't it? Going back to Tesco, you know you're going to get one last Tesco story, didn't you? Some years ago, there was a lady that came from Bentley. I don't know what part of it, from Bentley, and she'd get a bus into Doncaster, and she'd go to Sheffield for 2 hours every day to do some cleaning. I think she had an afternoon job somewhere else as well. It seemed a long way to go. I think she was more time travelling than she was cleaning. Now, we don't employ cleaners, they subcontract out, so they're one of these that they're not very well paid, and quite often they just stack them on the spot because they just want somebody else. That's just how it is with them. And she was one that, after a couple of years, it was decided she wasn't going to work there anymore. But she used to get the bus sometimes, with me, same bus as me sometimes, and I'd get to talk to her. She was coming into the shop, and one day I told her I was a Christian and I went to church, and she looked at me blankly as though I was speaking a foreign language. But she never said any more. Anyway, the next week she come in. Obviously, she's been asking what this Christian thing was that went to church. And she said, "Oh, I've been hearing about you people. You're them that don't believe in Christmas and Easter." I says, "Well, you do realise Christmas and Easter are Christian festivals." "Oh, no, I've been hearing about you're them that come and knock on the door." I said, "No, we're not those at all. We're very different. We do believe in Christmas and Easter." But after that, she was very nervous and rarely come to speak at all. She was somebody that had no idea about that. And, you know, that's what we face in our communities, isn't it, sometimes? I just want to finish with another North Korea story. It's one that comes from Open Doors. Young lady, Open Doors do work secretly in North Korea, and a story of a young lady, and she never realised her father was a Christian. Of course, he couldn't tell her, and she believed in the revolution, even though she was often food was scarce. She still believed in the revolution, and she was puzzled that her father sometimes read from an old book, and she did ask about it. She says, "Oh, it's just a book that about a man who preached from the side of a hill," and she said he found it a comfort. She never realised it was a Bible until the police came in. Somebody obviously tipped them off and arrested him and took him away, and took the Bible as well. And what they didn't find was an illegal radio. Now, all the radios in North Korea have to be tuned into the propaganda channel. Now, this particular radio was tuned into South Korea, and it was a Christian broadcast station. And she decided to listen to it, and the first thing she heard about was the man with Jesus preaching on the hillside. It was the first thing she heard. And in time she realised she had a choice to make. Do I follow this Jesus that my father so trusted in that he was prepared to risk everything for? Or do I believe in this revolution that is obviously failing? And she did become a Christian. Now, we don't face anything like that in our lives. We don't face anything like that. But we are here. And we're here because it's where God's placed us. And we need to remain faithful to God, to walk by faith, to follow the example of Daniel, and live just like him in this, our generation. Amen.